Bobby Duffy, you are a professor of public policy at King's College London and the author of several books. And today we will speak about your latest book, The Generation Myth: Why When We Are Born Matters Less Than You Think. Bobby, thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem. Really great to be here.
So, Bobby, we have lots to talk about, but can we start by you telling us a little bit about your background? How is it that you got into public policy? Your educational background. How is it that you became a professor? Just a general idea of who you are.
Sure. So I guess my main background is I did 20 odd years at the research firm Ipsos or Ipsos Mori in the UK. Ending up being the global director for the government and social research practice across lots of different countries. So I've always had an interest in public policy and in its different contexts around the world. And particularly how you engage citizens in that and where people really are. I suppose a lot of the themes of my work in the books has been about myths and realities, about how people see the world, how we understand it, and how that can often be driven by stereotypes and cliches, or by other biases and heuristics, depending on what you're talking about. And so understanding that, I think, is really, really important for us as individuals, but also governments and other people that are trying to engage with the public on really important issues. So I suppose I've kind of been preparing for that all throughout my career. And I guess the generational book is the culmination of around 15 years of looking at what's the myths and realities around what's truly different between generations.
And at what moment in your life, because this is not your first book, you decided to become a writer?
Oh, it's a good question. I've only done 2 full books, and the first one was published in 2018, and it took a couple of years. And I was just approached by publishers to do something around those misperception studies that we've been doing globally at Ipsos across up to 40 countries, and it was a really interesting and valuable data set. And I think that because the publishers approaching me saying this actually could make a really good book, rather than just a series of media releases and reports. And they were right. I think it was good to get it, to try to put it into more of a book type narrative where you get a bit more space to explore what's behind these misperceptions that people have and all the different explanations for it. Because it is kind of, lots of people were assuming this was just part of fake news and post-truth, and it was all about what the media was telling us on one side. And then there was lots of people, the more social psychologist side, thinking, no, this is all about our biases and heuristics, how we have confirmation biases, where we look for information that fits our worldview, etc. And really, the reality is it's the interaction between those two things. And I'm quite a methodologist by background, so I like when you can bring together different methods or disciplines to look at these types of problems. I think it gives you a much richer idea rather than proving your discipline explains why things are happening, actually looking across lots of different disciplines.
Right. Okay. In your book, you mentioned that this intergenerational friction is nothing new. I mean, from the times of the Roman Empire or the Greek Empire, whatever, there has been always this critique that the younger generation is doing things differently, that they are lazy, that they are this or the other thing. Now, in your book, you talk about several generations that, from my point of view as an immigrant, I see as the Western view of generations. For example, we got the silent generation, the baby boomers, Generation X, and I see them as a marketing cohort for marketers to be able to push products and services to these different segments of the population. And of course, I don't think a baby boomer in the United States will be the same as a baby boomer in Zambia, for example, or in Southeast Asia, because the experiences are not the same. So I wonder if you have any comments on that we are different generations depending on our country of origins.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, there's a number of points in there, and they're all really, really important. I think starting at the very beginning, there is something very important about generations, understanding does when you're born help shape who you are. And this is a long tradition in sociology and philosophy. Some of the great thinkers in philosophy and sociology think it's very important. So Auguste Comte and Karl Mannheim thought it was one of the most important factors in how societies change and develop, because it's based on the kind of fundamental facts of we get quite stuck in our ways as we get older, and you need new generations coming in to keep things fresh. They're not stuck with our understanding of what's the norm and how things should be done, and they challenge society to move forward. So there is something, a fundamental truth in this that's really important. That unfortunately has been caught up in what you're quite rightly, I think, identifying as a lot of nonsense about effectively used in marketing and other poor quality research to try to sum up whole generations in a few adjectives, or trying to claim that they all behave in the same sort of way. And we are flooded with those stereotypes and cliches about generations in media releases and headlines that we see in news articles or commentary articles. And that's a real shame, because it's, if you were summing up the key point of the book, is that generational change is a really big idea that's been horribly corrupted by these stereotypes, cliches, and myths. So that's the kind of position of the book. The international point is really important. It used to be, when Karl Mannheim, the Hungarian sociologist, was writing about generations at the beginning of the 20th century, it was just after the First World War, around the First World War. And that was that was one of the spurs to think about, would there be differences between generations? Because a generation of young people were sacrificed by older generations in that war, and there was a lot of resentment between generations. But at that time, they did think about generations as pretty much bounded within countries, that because it was all about your experience and we were not the globalized world we are today, it was very much seen as a national phenomenon. I think there are good reasons to think that will be more globalized now, because our world is more globalized, that communications is more globalized. I'm talking to you in Montreal. From London, we've got this direct connection now in a way that we just couldn't have had in the past. But also, it's not just technology, culture, the economy, much more interconnected, consumption, much more interconnected across countries, culture more generally interconnected. But still, there is a saying that I use in the book quite a lot, which is country before cohort. Because still, when you look at lots of factors, what country you were born in is much more determinant of your behaviors and attitudes than what cohort you're in. There's incredible differences between countries on really quite fundamental things, attitudes and behaviors, that really outstrip when you were born as a explanatory factor in how we act or how we think. So yes, it's a blend of these things. But saying that doesn't devalue entirely looking or thinking about things generationally. It just means we need to be a bit more subtle about it and not try to claim that there's that baby boomers are the same around the world. That's clearly not the case.
Well, so you just mentioned country before cohort, and well, of course, we are all rules don't apply to everyone, but I would assume that a gay person in the United States identify more than with a gay person in Russia than with their own country of origin.
A gay person, did you say?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I think there is communities of interest or communities of similar experience is an important cross-cutting factor in this. But I guess the point about the generational aspect of it is that when there is the fundamental point is that we are more malleable and shaped in our formative years. in the kind of teens and early 20s. So your experiences during that time kind of shape your worldview for it doesn't set you for life. You do still change and develop as you go through different life stages and life cycles, life cycle events. But there is something fundamental about when you were shaped, what was going on around then. So, and the examples of, gay people in different countries, time is really important because attitudes have changed to homosexuality hugely in lots of countries, but they've also not changed that much in some other countries where there's still a lot of discomfort among sections of the public in those countries. So it's a good example in the sense of it's an interplay between those types of things. Time is important. When you were born is important. It's kind of crazy to think that in places like the UK and the US, it was only the 1980s where the majority of the population, or at least half the population, thought that homosexuality was morally wrong. And we've come so far in those types of attitudes since then, very generationally. You can see in those attitudes older generations holding on to their older worldview and changing less than younger generations in it. But still, society as a whole has changed. So, yeah, I think it's that using generations as a frame that doesn't explain everything, but is an important contributory factor to it. In the book, I talk about 3 types of change that are really important. These cohort effects of generational difference, but then you do also have life cycle effects where we do change as we age and go through different life experiences of leaving home, getting a job, getting married, having kids, retiring. All those types of things have an effect. And then period effects of something happens and it changes everyone in society. And that can be slow, like attitudes to homosexuality, more cultural changes, or it can be very fast, like having a global pandemic. And really all change in society is an interplay of those 3 factors where generational cohort change is an important but not determinant factor in that. It just is the interplay between them.
In my podcast, I like from time to time to talk about investments because that's how this podcast started. And I have noticed that the older generations, the baby boomers that I know, for example, they like to invest in gold and they are always afraid about inflation. And finally, now we have high inflations. And those baby boomers who for decades have been telling me about inflation, the inflation fear, and why we should buy gold. Well, I mean, gold prices haven't gone up, but inflation fears are rising. On the other hand, millennials now they are buying cryptocurrency. So I mean, I guess there is a difference on the attitude of investment, and many millennials don't even know what is a depression, or they haven't suffered to a down cycle. So their perception of the economy and the stock market is totally different than those baby boomers who maybe their parents were telling about the Great Depression and how you had to save everything and buy gold and protect yourself against the evils of inflation.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, I do think, to be fair to millennials, they have experienced an incredible downturn in the 2008 financial crisis. So they've been very unlucky economically. That's one of the big stories of the past few decades, is how unfortunate millennials and then Gen Z have been when they're establishing their careers. But your point is an important one about our memory of different economic conditions. And I think, yes, it's true. We've had a low inflation, low interest rate, ridiculously low interest rate economy across lots of countries for a long time now. I did a study at King's a few years ago, which asked people, what do you think the average interest rate was, the base rate was in the UK, the average over the last 30 years, and people went incredibly low. They were guessing 2% was the average over the last 30 years, when it was actually 7%, because we've forgotten very quickly that an economy can move quite quickly to a high inflation, high interest rate economy. And that's really important, because people are making decisions on their mortgages, how much debt to take on et cetera, with this very faulty memory of that this very unusual quantitative easing, low interest rate economy is the norm, and we're stuck with it forever, when that's not necessarily the case. And we can see rising pressures on inflation, as you say, right now, and how banks respond, how central banks and federal agencies respond to this is going to be really, really important, because there's lots of stretched young people who would suffer hugely from interest rates and rate increases right now.
Right. And another issue is the perception of different generations in regards to COVID-19. If you are, what is it, a generation Z or generation Y, your perception of COVID-19 is, oh, I'm healthy, I got a good immune system, I'm gonna survive, I don't care. And let this COVID thing is what the boomer remover, as they say. You mentioned
Yes.
that in your book. But while if you are a baby boomer, you are maybe more cautious or more afraid or more aware of how to protect yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real story of the pandemic has been the incredible compliance of younger generations with measures that are mostly there to protect older and vulnerable populations. I think we've seen some high-profile examples of unrepresentative behavior in the media about young people flouting the rules, but they are unrepresentative. The vast majority of people of all ages are following the restrictions, and that's a really interesting case study in how we end up stereotyping age groups or generations, because we asked in a study with the New Scientist about how do people view different generations and how they behaved, and across different countries, the UK and the US, and people were much more likely to say that young people have been selfish rather than selfless, and that's not the case. You can the vast majority of young people have been incredibly selfless in taking measures that hurt them both socially and economically. Incredible impacts on young people's mental health, because at those types of age ranges, that type of social contact with your peers is really important to your sense of self. So they have sacrificed not just economically, but also in terms of social connection with others, a very formative time of their life. So yeah, that is a really important misperception we have of generations, that young people have not taken the pandemic seriously, when actually the vast majority of them have, not for their own benefit or own fear of the disease, but through concern about other people.
I will bring out a few other social issues, and you tell me if this is society moving along, or is it a generational difference? For example, owning a car. Is this society moving along, or is this a generational difference between one generation and the other one?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. We did think it was a generational break in young people's connection to car culture. But the longer the data has gone on, it shows much more that it's more of a delay in buying cars until a later age group. There's a little bit of people carpooling more, or the sharing economy in cities where public transport is better and you can just pick up a car in a sharing scheme. But that's not really the main driver. That's not how most people live. It's more the case that younger generations were poorer for longer, couldn't afford cars, more living at home, less stable jobs, all those types of things. And as millennials in particular moved into more of their 30s, car ownership recovered significantly. So it's not really the generational break that some were saying in the early days of seeing millennials come through. So I don't think we've seen the end of car culture.
Wow. Okay. How about drug use? Recently, 2 years ago, I bought some stocks in a marijuana farming
Mm,
company right here in
mm,
Montreal. I mean, not right here in Canada. So I wonder how much the legalization of drugs and the drug of use in general has been either society advancing or a difference between generation. And now we have countries like Portugal decriminalizing all hard drugs.
mm.
I don't know what's your take on that.
Yeah, it's actually quite a complicated picture on drugs. There's no big generational break in any direction. There's changes here and there, and you can see the legalization of marijuana has formed attitudes more among young people because they're in their formative years and you're decriminalizing something. So, but it hasn't really shifted use very much, not as much as people feared. So I think there is enough in the data and trends to say that there's not a massive shift in society overall that people were expecting, and the decriminalization can continue. I mean, it is one of those things that has shifted quite a long way, particularly in places like the US, where there is less fear about the criminalization. It is still a generational difference with younger people, younger generations more relaxed about it. And then interestingly, there is a life cycle effect, is where baby boomers, when they were younger, were pretty relaxed about it, and now getting more worried about it as their kids and grandkids are probably more exposed to it. So we do kind of get more cautious as we get older, as well as having a generational effect on this.
Okay, many countries are having now an existential crisis because the fertility rates are going
Mm,
down. Many people say that they are having this younger generation is having less sex than the baby
mm,
boomers, and I don't know how much truth there is on that. There is the fact that the fertility rate is in fact going down. So
mm.
I guess because we are more busy paying our debts, or God knows
Yeah.
what, or is it a generational? I don't know, getting our distancing from sex.
Yeah, so again, it's a really interesting blend of those three different types of effects going on. So there was definitely a generation on generation decline in fertility rates, but it's not. It started a long time ago in most Western or developed countries. It was more starting with the baby boomers and then Gen X. That fertility rates started to fall below the replacement rate that you needed to maintain the age balance in societies. So that there is a generational effect in that, but it can't be blamed on this younger generation. That's much more, these big trends in women having more control, having more career ambition and opportunity, education levels generally going up, etc., etc. Lots and lots of big impacts on that. The second point is interesting though, and is more about a big shift, first for millennials and now with Gen Z, where sex lives have been delayed later and later among young people, particularly with Gen Z. And this is partly because adulthood has been delayed quite a bit for those groups more generally, more living at home, longer time in education, all of those types of things, marriage later and having kids later. So it's a break that's based on a delay in people's life cycles. And then, I mean, there is period effects of the pandemic, and I'm really interested in how that plays out over time, because we've had social distancing, much less chance of meeting partners, setting up relationships than you've had in the past. And that kind of period effect of this break in connection, again, at a key juncture for young people where you're supposed to be forming and testing those types of relationships. Now it's gone on for 2 years and will continue for at least some time. That will accelerate these trends towards later and later experiences, which is a worry, given that we do have a fertility challenge with our aging societies.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry, I'm putting your feet to the fire with all these
That's all
questions.
right.
But
No,
last
great.
question. So, census studies in the United States and Canada, and I don't know about England, show that there is a decline in organized religions, in particular Catholicism, let's say.
Yeah.
So I don't know what's the case in England. And of course, I see also an increase in other spiritual leniencies, tendencies. So I don't know whether it's, once again, is society moving along or it's just a generational thing.
Religious attachment to organized religions is very generational in countries like the US, UK, Canada, and there is a generation on generation decline in that attachment to organized religion. So the rise of the nuns, as it's thought about in the US, is a real trend, and it is in large part not fully generationally driven. It's interesting though, globally, the death of religion is the opposite of what's happening, really, because looking forward, there's going to be just as many, if not more, people attached to a religion worldwide in 10, 20, 30 years' time, because population growth is happening in more religious places, whether that is Christianity and Islam in Africa, or wherever. It's so the death of religion globally is massively exaggerated, but it's very different in Western societies. And there's also a really important distinction between that kind of cultural connection to religion, which is very much on the wane in places like the US and Canada and the UK, and then the more active involvement in religion, which is holding up much better. The people who actually go to religious services, etc., that is declining much less because it's effectively, so some religious scholars talk about it moving from a conscript army to a professional army. These are people who no longer feel you have to be attached to a religion. That's just part of culture and society, more to people who are committed to it. So, and that includes going beyond Christianity to Islam and other religions, which tend to be people who are more likely to take part in religious ceremonies and religious life more generally.
Well, okay, Bobby, I felt like I asked you a whole bunch of random questions. I wonder if there's any particular question that you would have wished that I had asked.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's the main theme of the book is that these differences, these mythical, stereotypical differences between generations are really important. It's really important to debunk them, not just because they're inaccurate, but because they give this false sense of separation between generations. The stereotypes create a distance or even conflict between generations, and that's why it's really important, because actually generations are much more interconnected than you think. You would think from the media coverage of baby boomers at war with millennials, etc., etc., and that's a real shame, because there's a really important it's really important for society for those intergenerational connections to be encouraged, because we get a lot from connecting old and young together in our society. So that's kind of the main driver. It's not just out of interest that I'm trying to point out these stereotypes and myths, and particularly this fake sense of conflict between generations. It's also to try to challenge that, because being connected really is important to us as individuals, but also in tackling big challenges that face the whole of society, like climate change or rising inequality, or whatever the challenge is.
Right. I like to add, I'm a member of a group called Toastmasters International, which is a place where I'm learning how to do public speaking. And in a place like this, I get to gather with people from many generations, from Generation Z to people from the silent generation, and just this exchange of ideas of where are we coming from and what is life from my point of view, that help us interconnect and understand each other much better. And like you said, they're just less difference than we think. It's just that we are going through different stages of life. So that's So I'm totally in agreement with you. Bobby, of course, the last question is, can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you do?
It's called The Generation Myth in the US and Canada. And we do actually have a website where you can see some of the analysis, and that's just generations.org. If you look that up, you can get some of the data or some of the key points from there.
Bobby, thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.